4 games, 4 Premier League defeats for Norwich City, but there's a whole lot of context behind those results. Not been the best start to life in the Premier League, but we will dissect it as ever. This is the PinkUn Norwich City Podcast, reflecting on Norwich City's 1-0 defeat to Arsenal at the Emirates on Saturday. Connor Southwell standing in for Dave Freezer, joined by Paddy, Davitt, to look at everything about that game on Saturday, which was... Well, this was going to be my first point, really, Paddy. Does this result sort of sum up Norwich City in the Premier League? Quite close to getting something. Looked like possibly at one stage they were well in the game, but ultimately falling the wrong side of maybe a little bit of luck and some questionable defending.
I don't think we need to continue with the podcast. That's pretty much summed it up for me, Connor. I think we can stop right there. Hit stop on the record. Yeah, that is increasingly the way these games are panning out. And okay, 4 games in, so we can't extrapolate that this is how the rest of the season will pan out from here. But lots of good things in any given 90 minutes, even, the Liverpool and Man City results. There were positive elements. But there is a common theme, and that is, for me, it's both boxes. It's Norwich are pretty toothless now in the final third at this level so far against these teams, and that needs to change. Otherwise, fundamentally, they're not going to create enough chances and score enough goals to get the points that they're going to need to stay in the division. It's very simple. And then, when we say the other box, it's not just simply a focus on Norwich's defenders. I think as a collective, out of possession, at this level, if you make the type of errors Norwich make, and that's coughing up cheap possession in bad areas of the field, as we sit here this morning, day after the Arsenal game, it's 4 games played, league games, no points, 1 goal, and that was a penalty, Timu Pukki against Leicester, and those measures are simply not going to be good enough. And on those measures, there's no discernible difference to what they did 2 seasons ago over the entire piece when they were a long, long way short. And all those analogies about going to wars without the requisite ammunition came into play. But off the back of the transfer window they've just concluded, you don't feel that is the case. So, and it was emphasised again, and we'll get into it in due course, with the the changes he made, and it didn't really dilute the quality, I didn't think. So that tells you the depth of the squad is incomparable between this season and 2 seasons ago. So there are similarities at this stage, but I think the underlying optimism I would retain is that they do feel like they are more competitive and that they are closer to what is required to get results in this league, but not quite yet there. And until they reach that threshold, then we're still going to probably be talking about errors defensively and not offering enough in forward areas. And that's not really a recipe for anything other than a return to the Championship.
No, it really isn't. You kind of mentioned there maybe the positives, which is probably good to get out of the way relatively early on, and we'll perhaps come back to a certain individual in the Norwich defence who was very good yesterday a bit later on. But is it what you said there in terms of this Norwich team in the opening 4 games? We haven't seen a 90-minute performance. We haven't seen a consistent, positive 90-minute performance. We've seen patches. Daniel Farke thought that for 65 minutes of the Liverpool game, Norwich were pretty good. You could say in patches of the Leicester game as well. They were very good, probably around half an hour to half time at the Emirates on Saturday. Park Man City, because there were probably very few positives to take out of that one. But this does feel like it's a group of players and a squad and a head coach as well, I suppose, that is going to grow into this season, whereas that probably wasn't the stage 2 years ago. They burst onto the scene. It always felt like maybe they didn't necessarily have a bit more to give. They didn't have the quality to grow into. It maybe does feel like that with this squad, or certainly I think so at least.
Oh, 100%. And you only have to look at the makeup of the personnel yesterday, that you can dip out Todd Cantwell, put in Kieran Dowell, Ben Gibson comes out. There we need to remind anybody, an £8 million summer signing. That's the pedigree of player who wasn't getting in the 11 yesterday, and his place was taken by a 19-year-old young Irishman making his Premier League debut, Mio Rashica, who has been and was awarded August Player of the Month for Norwich, but arguably their most impressive of the clutch of summer signings so far. But as Daniel explained it after the game yesterday, for reasons mainly around his workload for Kosovo over this recent international period, he dropped out. And who comes in? Another £9 million young attacker Daniel Farke rates as potentially world-class in Christoph Schollis. So, and that's even before you get to the two guys who came in the sort of final 48 hours or so of the window, which is Ozan Kabak and Matthias Norman, both unused substitutes yesterday. There's absolutely no doubt this squad is far better in terms of the quality, I feel, and the depth of the quality than 2 seasons ago. So, but taking those two as a prime example, Daniel said they literally turned up on Thursday, and that was the first time they were almost having to do their introductions to the rest of their teammates. So to pitch them in against Arsenal would have been very premature. And for those reasons, your mind goes back to what Daniel said off the back of a very, very COVID-disrupted pre-season, that ultimately the time to start judging will be, for him, was after this first international break. Well, we've got to that point now. We've got those 4, what was supposedly, when the fixtures came out in the summer, a nightmarish start. Well, that's beyond Norwich now. That's the other side. And now they go into this Saturday, and I know we'll get into that in more depth maybe later on, but Watford at home, one of their fellow promoted sides. They beat Villa on the opening day, but they haven't picked up a point since. And now, if you like, the real harsh assessments of whether Farke and his players have got enough at this level are going to start. The build up to this game will be centred around, right, this, okay. I mean, they were talking about must win for Mikel Arteta on Saturday, and he himself described it as that after the game. I don't think given we're only 5 games in, as it will be this weekend, I think that's premature to say it's a must win. But can you imagine if Norwich come out of Watford at Carrow Road without another point on the board? Then, I think all the optimistic shoots are going to be buried, because ultimately, if you're not able to get points from a fellow promoted side on home turf, then, it's hard to see how they can begin to sort of construct an argument that they can survive in this division. So it's, there's still enough for me optimism that needs to be kind of at the forefront of everybody's minds going into this weekend. But it is a very fragile optimism, and it's based on a sense that, for all those reasons, the disrupted pre-season, the players coming in very late in the window, then the international disruption of the break, that Farke now is a full week, starting from Monday at Colney, with new and old players to integrate them and meld them into a unit that, when they appear at Carrow Road on Saturday, are able to be, at the risk of repeating what I've already said, too potent up front and defensively sound at the back. And that isn't defensively just in terms of the back 4, but also the protection in front, i.e. Matthias Norman maybe coming in. So, I think it's going to be very difficult to sort of talk in these upbeat terms if we sat here, this time next week, and Watford have come to town and gone away with the 3 points, because then, any sort of pessimism that is already around and already in the air, that's only going to grow, because if you can't beat the teams in and around you, and they didn't do that anywhere near well enough, if at all, 2 seasons ago, then if that trend is going to continue to be quite a negative, regressive trend, then let's be honest, we all know where that path leads, and that's back to the Championship. So, it is maybe hard to still tip towards more the optimistic side, because you look at that league table and it doesn't make for pretty reading, and also the goal output for me is very concerning, and there's bigger questions there about Timu Pukki and the system that they're playing now, and does he look comfortable? And obviously the removal of his creator-in-chief in Emi Buendia, that hasn't been replaced yet, and all those questions will continue to persist if Norwich are not offering enough in terms of the final third. So, at the moment, still tipped towards the optimistic side of the ledger, but that is based pretty much exclusively on the business they've done, and Farke now getting a chance, a proper chance to integrate those new players into the players he already had, and building on some of the more positive aspects of these performances.
Yeah, you mentioned fragile optimism there. I've got the league table up in front of me, and you look from maybe 14th, where Southampton currently sit, all the way down to Norwich in 20th at the bottom. And there are only two teams in that clutch of teams that have won a game, and that's Watford and Arsenal. Of course, Watford beat Villa on the opening day, and Arsenal beat Norwich yesterday. And beyond that, a few sort of smatterings of draws. But Southampton, even in 14th, are yet to win a game, have picked up 3 draws. Leeds obviously play on Sunday, which is before or after we're recording this, rather. They're yet to pick up a win. But Norwich are the only team who haven't yet picked up a point, and they have the worst goal difference in the league already. Have conceded 11, only scored 1, as you mentioned, yet to score a goal from open play. And we'll perhaps come back to Arsenal's shot tally in a moment, but that does seem to be the issue, doesn't it, at the moment? Not necessarily the chances they're conceding, because and perhaps we'll come on to why that 30 shot statistic is a little bit misleading to an extent. But it's the lack of cutting edge at the top end of the pitch at the moment. They didn't really, and we talk about the spells of positive football they had yesterday, particularly before half-time. They didn't really look like scoring, did they? And this will be the issue again for Daniel Farke, and it does nothing to maybe quiet down the debate about Teemu Pukki and his role in the team. But personally, I think it probably extends a bit wider than Teemu Pukki. They're not scoring goals because of Teemu Pukki. It seems to be a structural issue rather than a Teemu Pukki problem.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, there's just a general, and it's not just about Teemu Pukki, but there's a general lack of conviction or belief for me when Norwich players are getting into those opportunities to actually test. I mean, Ramsdale making his debut for Arsenal yesterday, off the top of my head, I think it was a floaty left-footed curler from Max Aarons 25 yards out in the first half was the only real work he had to do. Well, that's simply, not good enough. If you're Norwich and you're trying to get a point / 3 points at this level, you need to be working keepers far better than that. I mean, Teemu Pukki had a couple of chances in stoppage time, and again, I don't know, because he's played at this level before and he knows what it's all about. Whether it is the bigger issue about his confidence is a little bit sapped because he's playing in a system which maybe doesn't maximise, his individual qualities in quite the same way as when they're in the Championship. And you have to keep mentioning him. His chief partner in crime is no longer on the pitch anymore, and that telepathic understanding they had. But he had 2 shots in stoppage time. There was one where his movement was good. He got across his marker near post. Rashica cuts it in from the left hand side, and it was just a very tame attempt at a shot, and I think it took a deflection and went for a corner, and then it might have been directly from that corner. I'll tell a lie, it might have been one of the deeper free kicks they put in towards the end, and he's brought the ball down lovely and got a shot away, and maybe on that one, it did take a block from an Arsenal defender, so it was technically on target, but he just strikes me as a man lacking in confidence, and maybe that is a lot to do with the realisation on his part that this is a different Norwich and it's a different type of setup Farke is striving to achieve. Injecting players like Zolis and Rashica into that attacking mix. You are but fundamentally suggesting it's going to be slightly different to the Cantwell Buendia access with Pukki and far more kind of technically proficient and almost trying to thread and work out the puzzles of players in and around them in those central areas. It feels like they want to be far more potent maybe in wider areas now and balls into the box. I don't think necessarily is Teemu Pukki's forte. It's balls over defenders and down channels for him to run onto, and so far, he would be in his rights to say he hasn't really had the service over these 4 games that he would need to showcase what we feel he's got, which is goals in him. But how do you fundamentally change that if Daniel feels that the overall balance of the team is now better suited to maybe changing what he wants from Teemu Pukki? Then Teemu Pukki has to try and get on board with it. Otherwise, he'll come out the side and maybe a Josh Sargent when he's fit or an Adamida will get an opportunity. But given how important he has been to Daniel Farke, I think he'd be loath to do that. So it's one of, and maybe you could argue with those stats you quoted about their lack of output, maybe the biggest structural issue that the coach has to sort at this moment in time, because if you cannot have an effective Timu Pukki leading the line, then it does nullify a lot of what Norwich are trying to do under Daniel Farke and have tried to do in previous seasons. And at the moment, he's not effective, and at the top end of the pitch, they're not effective. They're, as I say, it feels like it's a work in progress. But how much time can they reasonably afford to give this? It was interesting. There was a pre-match interview with Tim Krul to the BBC, and he was more or less saying, you can't really judge us until January when we've played all these teams. But if the reality is by January you're some points adrift, then the time for judgment is past, isn't it? Ultimately, they need to maintain certainly that their position in that rank of clubs you listed there, maybe, who are, let's be honest, none of those are exactly ripping up any trees at this stage. So it's not exclusively directed at Norwich, these sort of question marks around productivity and picking up points on a regular basis. There are a clutch of clubs who are all going to have to answer the same questions. But at the minute, you don't see in that top end of the pitch that Norwich carry enough about them to trouble teams at this level. And until that changes, it's going to be a struggle. And that's obviously before we get to maybe some of the structural issues in terms of the protection or lack of to that back four. So, there's plenty of work ahead for Daniel, his coaches and those players to distill the good things that they've done in these 4 games, but to produce a far more robust, consistent 90-minute type of template, which you would hope then, be good enough to get points against, if not the top bracket of clubs in this league, certainly the majority of the other teams.
It does feel that they possibly might need a different kind of profile of striker up there. The 2 you mentioned there, certainly more physical, more willing to hold up the ball if they are going to persist with these. As we said, a slight change for Sheets to someone with pace who wants to essentially get into wide positions and look to cross the ball. We saw Norwich look to cross the ball quite often. It was when they did go forward, it was kind of the success they did have was getting into wide positions as opposed to those central positions. So you do wonder if that's something you look at. But yeah, you would imagine Daniel Farke will be loath to certainly drop Timu Pukki out of it. So is there a solution that Norwich City can find? And maybe it does lie in that midfield, which is an area of the pitch it feels like we've been speaking about since they lifted the championship trophy back in May, really, doesn't it? When we knew Ollie Skip was going to depart and Alex Tettey as well, Mario Vrancic, and it was then about getting options in. Matthias Norman's arrived. He probably arrived at the Emirates not fully aware of some of his teammates' names. I think that's probably fair enough, given how little time he's had at Colney. So it does feel, yeah, like you said earlier on, it's that fragile optimism, but equally everyone knows the effects that defeats and consecutive defeats in the Premier League can have, because it can knock confidence, it can affect performances. So for all the talk of maybe good spells and good patches and promise and green shoots and everything that we've spoken about in the last few weeks, as Daniel Farke said, praise doesn't get you anywhere, doesn't it? It doesn't keep you in the Premier League, and it will be points. And at the moment, Norwich City aren't getting those, and they need to find a way to do that. Just to talk about that defensive protection and then move this on before we look at that Aubameyang goal and maybe debate that a little bit. 30 shots, that's kind of the figure that has been bandied about. Certainly a lot of Norwich fans have raised that on social media when kind of talking about the game as a whole. I actually felt for really the first hour it was a fairly low margin game. There wasn't too many clear-cut opportunities, certainly not for Norwich, as we've discussed, but not really for Arsenal either. I mean, they had the one where Aubameyang was played over the top, but a lot of their shots were coming from range, wasn't it? And we know the way Norwich defend, they're probably not good enough to stick in a relatively low block and look to defend teams for 90 minutes, because that's not the way they play. So what is the solution for Norwich City being more defensively robust, but equally having that sort of cutting edge at the top end of the pitch? Because it seems like that is maybe a balance that is missing, because Norwich City are going to concede goals at this level. And Daniel Farke said after the game, if you meet Manchester City, Chelsea, Liverpool, even Arsenal on a day where they're at 100%, and I don't think Arsenal were at 100% by any stretch, but it can be very difficult at this level, even if you do produce a performance that is very good.
Well, but you loathe to continually hark back to 2 seasons ago, but that inherent structural issue was never solved, and that was started with Leitner and Tribal in the opening weeks of the season, ended up with McLean and Alex Tettey, as 2 pairs, 2 contrasting midfield screening, deeper line, whatever label you want to attach, pair of midfielders. So it's not quite in the same scenario at the minute because, certainly Kenny McLean offers a bit more bite and Lucas Rupp to an extent. But there is something fundamentally not quite clicking with the balance of that midfield at the minute because, we just had a long section there where we're discussing what they're not offering in forward areas. So clearly, that isn't just a focus on Timu or Josh Sargent or Adam Ida. There's midfield issues or parts of that equation as well, which have to be resolved. And likewise, you can look at 30 shots and think, oh my God, but I think there was 10 of those were on target. You made the point before we started recording. A lot of those were very speculative, long-range efforts. I'd make the point as well that Daniel made after the game that he obviously had to chase that game in the final 20 minutes, made a lot of attacking minded introductions, Cantwell, Rashica, and obviously Adam Ida. And that clearly opened up the game, and then Arsenal's better chances in that block of 10 came in that period. So, there are reasons why it was on paper. You look at it, you think, well, that's a ridiculous amount of chances to cough up if you're the defensive side. But yeah, I'd agree. I don't think it was kind of the Alamo for 90 minutes. Far from it. Norwich were for phases of that game in the first hour, 65 minutes, they were in control of the game. They were dictating the flow of that game without packing too much of a punch at the top end. So if you were Farke, you'd probably turn around and say, in the context of this discussion about midfielders and screening, well, it worked for an hour or 65 minutes, but I still felt within that, there was instances where, Rupp and Lees Malou and McLean to a lesser extent, but defensively, you do worry that trio aren't going to be able to provide the protection required to shield a back four from, as it was on Saturday, Bukayo Saka or Nicolas Pepe or Aubameyang, pouring through, irrespective of Arsenal's very poor by their standards start to the season. Those three, A, highly rated, B, expensively purchased. Saka would be, obviously, if he was on the open market, go for many, many millions. And that is the quality Norwich were trying to subdue yesterday. And, is Norman the be-all and end-all? Well, we'll probably find out soon enough. But I don't think he's a like-for-like for Skip. So straight away, there's going to still have to be some degree of evolution from what we had last season, which was more often than not a Skip McLean, Skip Rupp at the start of the season, but essentially a two in front of the back four, which their primary role was breaking up play, putting out fires, and also building the play from deep. Now, Norwich haven't as yet found that blend in a three, whether it was Gilmour, Rupp, Lees Malou, or McLean thrown in the mix. Now they've got Matthias Norman, comes with a label of a defensive midfielder. I think he's a bit more than that if you sort of look at the amount of shots he's had when he was at Rostov. And as a result, again, structurally, Farke needs to, work out which personnel in which shape across midfield offer him that balance between protecting his back four but also linking the play and trying to be the constituent parts to supply, if it's Pookie for the time being, or the other strikers, with enough service and enough decent chances for Norwich to carry a threat going the other way. So really fascinating how Daniel deconstructs that, because I think Norman, you would feel, given he was one they'd chased for quite some time over this summer, they have identified him as, if not a like-for-like for Skip, certainly can take on many of the facets of Ollie Skip's game. So he's going to play. And then if it is Daniel persisting with a three in midfield, who are the other two from Gilmour, Rupp, Lees Malou and Kenny McLean? And for me, I'm not going to make any predictions because we looked a bit foolish yesterday when we did the team news and Zolis is playing and Gilmour's out and Amobama Daly's playing. So I think that is a reminder not to try and second-guess Daniel Farke when it comes to team selections. But all joking aside, and we said that, I think we said this pretty much over the summer when they were looking for, if it wasn't going to be Skip, a Skip replacement. Getting that right could hold the key to how this season pans out. Because if Norwich finds that balance and that blend between a midfield which can offer a deeper line midfielders, should I say, that can offer that protection, but also be able to link to the more progressive midfield types and the forward players ahead of them, then I think with a fair win, Norwich will be competitive and should be able to pick up points. Whether that will be good enough in the final analysis to finish 17th or above, who knows? But at the minute, certainly in these first 4 league games, the midfield mix isn't offering that balance. But in both areas, I would say defensive protection and also attacking wise. So, as much as finding the answer at the top end of the pitch, I think there's another structural key facet that Daniel needs to get right now moving forward, and that is what that midfield balance looks like.
Yeah, as much as we kind of talk about the loss of Emi Buendia from an attacking sense and how Norwich have maybe sought to replace him with not an out-and-out like-for-like player, maybe 2 or 3 players and breaking up his attributes that I think it was the Villa chief exec explained so well after Jack Grealish. And it kind of feels like Norwich have tried to do a similar thing with Buendia, and maybe they've looked to do a similar thing with Skip as well, because realistically they probably weren't for their finance and the resource that they have at their disposal going to be able to find another Ollie Skip, certainly not for the fee that would have commanded. So maybe we're looking at a Norwich City midfield that is trying to blend his best attributes as well and trying to find that solution. Equally, Norwich did play a 2 quite a lot in the Premier League 2 years ago and ultimately look at where that put them. So it does feel like we're maybe in a realm where Daniel Farke's trying to implement the lessons he's learned, but equally, as you said, they're just trying to find the blend. And that central role that there's been so much emphasis on with Billy Gilmore increasingly doesn't feel like the kind of screening role that we saw Ollie Skip do last year. It feels more like a role that's certainly sort of geared to being in possession and being more of an orchestrator than maybe someone who's a screener, with then the 2 on the left and the right, maybe adding a bit more legs up and down. And something I've noticed is throughout the first few games, I don't think they did it particularly well in the first half against Leicester, but did it slightly better yesterday, was their keenness to press and to really go at opponents, which has been kind of a marked change from perhaps what we've seen under Daniel Farke in the past, where his teams have primarily kind of stood off opponents and looked to be in a bit more of a deep block. So that's something interesting to watch as well, and to see how that evolves. And we talk about results affecting confidence of players; they can also affect confidence of and thought process of coaches. So it's going to be fascinating to see how it develops, but it's important to note Daniel Farke did predict this. He did say it would be a bumpy start to life in the Premier League. I think he said in his pre-match press conference on Friday that he was expecting the first 4 or 5 games to be relatively difficult.
From true crime to football, Brexit to folklore. For more great podcasts from Archant, head to audioboom.com/channel/Archant.
We'll come on to Watford and just how seismic that looks in just a moment. But let's talk about, first and foremost, Pad, let's talk about the changes that Daniel Farke did make. 4 that came in. Rupp, Omar Bamadeli, Kieran Dowell and Christos Solis all came in. I think the response to as you referenced there, our team news video was one of shock when we saw that team news, because there were probably a lot of changes there we weren't expecting. Certainly not Lucas Rupp, certainly not Kieran Dowell. And interestingly, Daniel made a point that Kieran Dowell was thrown in for kind of his defensive side of his game on Kieran Tierney.
He did. That was part of it, and also it felt like he talked about his focus and the manner he trained over the 2 weeks, and we know from Daniel Farke's longevity in the post that he places a huge emphasis on what he sees in any given training week. Immediately popping into my head is the Bournemouth omissions last season, was it, was it 2 seasons ago, of past season of Cantwell and Buendia, because brackets didn't like what he'd seen in training in the lead up. So that was Dowell in, Cantwell out, and bit of a surprise that he flagged up Kieran Dowell's sort of defensive instincts, because I don't think that's something we naturally would associate with his play. But yeah, I thought, much like Norwich as a unit, I thought for 60, 65 minutes, he was probably getting what he'd hoped from that changed lineup. But there was a growing sense for me anyway, watching it live, that they were starting to slip off those levels, and Arsenal were beginning to dictate how that game was going to pan out. And the manner of the goal is frustrating. We'll get into that in due course. But the fact that Arsenal scored wasn't a huge surprise, I didn't think anyway. I thought the areas that Norwich were good in that first 45 minutes, certainly after Arsenal's blistering sort of opening start, and they'd weathered that period. We didn't see enough of that in the second half. And one of those facets for me was Dowell. Dowell was kind of that link when they were trying to counter. I liked signs of that understanding he was building with Jolis. There was a couple of instances where they combined quite nicely, and Jolis on one occasion gets himself down the left-hand side. You talked about it. Threat from wide areas and put a lovely ball across the box, and there was no takers, which underlines a lot of the point we've been talking about in terms of how toothless they look. But it was still, I mean, not just Dowell, but broadening it out. I mean, still huge calls for Daniel. And yes, probably not massively a shock given the international dimension that he overlay on top of any tactical or technical issues specific to Arsenal. You talked about Rashica, for example, played a lot of minutes for Kosovo. He played on the Wednesday against Spain in Spain. Kosovo clearly didn't have a lot of the ball. He was doing a lot of chasing and harrying, and then he gets back late. He sits on the coach for 3.5 hours, and bear in mind he was one of the COVID affected players, so he didn't have the most perfect of pre-seasons either. And the same with Gilmour. Gilmour, as Daniel said, probably played as many minutes for him this season than any other player in green and yellow. He goes up with Scotland. He's a key man for them. Starts all their qualifiers, and as Daniel said, there's a lot of hype, a lot of spotlight on that guy every time he plays, and I think he was man of the match in Scotland's win over Moldova. So there was a whole fresh wave of he's the answer to our prayers if you're a Scotland fan, which he probably should be used to by now. But that was the reasoning, and I think it's brave from Daniel to not go with Gilmour. But again, is he looking at Watford at home and thinking that's a better environment in terms of Norwich's weight of possession and territory, that game potentially, that Gilmour is going to be better suited to that than possibly would have been at the Emirates if you expected Arsenal to dominate the possession. So, I think there was he wouldn't talk about it obviously this past weekend, but I think there was maybe a Watford flavour to some of those choices as well, because obviously he knows Watford is a far more winnable game than Arsenal away, and for those reasons, I think he's not targeted Watford, but clearly looked at Watford maybe when he was sitting down and working out his personnel for Arsenal. But still very brave to go with a back four that had 19-year-old Omobama Daly, Max Aarons, yes, very experienced relatively, but still only 21, and Brandon Williams 21 as well. That's, as Daniel said, there won't have been any other Premier League team this weekend who went into battle with 3 youngsters essentially in their back four, but that is, as he said, Norwich's way. That's how they have to go about it. We saw that in the Championship, didn't we, with Aarons, Jamal and Ben Godfrey, very similar template. And I don't think, my sense was when that team was dropped, I don't think anybody was overly unhappy to see Omobama Daly in and Gibson out, maybe for reasons we've discussed on various platforms recently. And Daniel talked about with Omobama Daly, it was very much the pace in Arsenal's back line. He is probably their quickest defender outside of Hanley. And Farke felt that was an attribute they needed more of in that back four for that game. So, yeah, a lot of factors went into that team selection, but there's no doubt it was quite surprised that he went quite as big as, 2 teenage debutants in Jolis and Omobama Daly at Premier League level, Cantwell out, Dowell in, and obviously Gilmour, the blue-eyed boy from Chelsea out, and Lucas Rupp in. So, ultimately, I don't think it was, albeit the result that they were hoping for, but as a performance, I don't think that warranted anybody really forensically saying Daniel got his selections wrong. For me, anyway, I thought there was more positives than negatives to the players who came in. So one can only hope that if it was part of a wider plan that Watford's the start of maybe a winnable burst of games, that you take some of the heat off Rashica, for example, and Gilmour yesterday. That maybe Norwich will reap the benefit now going into this swing of more winnable games in inverted commas. But it says what we said at the outset, that Farke himself, and he's the one who matters because he's ultimately the one who selects the teams. He feels he has the batting order that is much deeper, that he can make those changes and still put a team out which he feels is good enough to get performances, but off the back of that, hopefully results as well. And ultimately, if you're the head coach of a Norwich team, you don't want to be sitting down every Friday morning with a piece of paper knowing 10 of the 11 names, because there isn't the competition in the squad to really force his hand. He wants, I'm sure, as many selection headaches as he can get from week to week, because that tells you then he has a squad of constituent parts that are all relatively, this mantra we heard from Stuart Webber over the summer, they wanted quality over quantity. And you look at one area of the team and, okay, it's not quite firing yet in terms of goals and assists, but left-hand side of midfield, you've got Jolis or Rashica. Well, I think most Norwich fans would be very happy if either of them played week to week. And that level of Premier League potential, which we all hope, develops eventually into actual Premier League productivity. But if you can get those type of competitive battles within his squad all from back to front, then ultimately that should drive up performances and hopefully results.
Yeah, part of me is wondering if we'll reach a stage this season where we see potentially a back four of Aarons, Kabak, Omobamidele and Brandon Williams, which would be remarkable. I think the oldest player there would be Kabak at 21. Maybe Aarons is slightly older, I'm not sure, but one of those two certainly. And then with Gilmore in front of those, you're looking at a very young kind of back five, so to speak. So that would be interesting to see if we see that at some point. But yeah, like you say, it was interesting. And as we've kind of spoken about, for 65 minutes, you would probably argue that he called it just about right in terms of the way that Norwich City played, and they were certainly in the game. And I mean, we've kind of spoken chapter and verse about Norwich's issues, but you could probably break the game up into three segments. You kind of had the initial burst from Arsenal, and then Norwich regaining a bit of control between about 30 minutes to probably just before an hour, and then maybe the late Arsenal push for a win, essentially, which they so desperately needed after kind of the barrage of criticism that has come their way, which of course led to the Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang goal, one which has raised a lot of controversy, certainly amongst Norwich fans. Daniel Farke opted to kind of not speak about the VAR incident so much, which effectively I think now, having seen a few replays, I think I can call, because if you watch it back, and you have to watch it back a fair few times, Nicolas Pepe, I think, kicks the ball accidentally when he was on the floor after Krul makes a save from his initial shot, which effectively renders the whole thing a new phase of play, at which point Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang is then onside to tap the ball home. So very fine margins, but given what Norwich City fans saw before the international break and Kenny McLean's header getting disallowed for Todd Cantwell being, well, essentially his heel being offside for standing in front of Kasper Schmeichel and interfering with play, probably a tough one to take, Pad. I think that's fair. But then rolling that back even further, there's some controversy about an alleged handball from Bukayo Saka in the build-up anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly Hanley and the Norwich players felt that was the case. It's a bit inconclusive on a lot of the footage that I've seen, because it's almost he's on the blind side of the camera, Saka, so you can't quite see that. But then surely, presumably, the far side assistant might have been able to see that. But you're saying taking it back, and actually for me now, with the benefit of digesting it in far more depth than we get in real time as it unfolds in the ground, it actually is really sourced from, Tim Krul trying to play another diagonal out to Max Aarons, who's mid-air trying to pluck the ball down as Arsenal players converge on him, and his touch isn't good enough, and Arsenal recycle in a very dangerous area. So, yes, thereafter, there were causes for, certainly the handball element, causes for complaint if you're a Norwich player or coach. But ultimately, that goal is sourced in an error from Norwich, and that isn't isolated. Unfortunately, Leicester, both goals, errors from Norwich players. Some of the Man City goals, errors from Norwich players. And it doesn't even have to be major errors at this level, because the players they're playing against are so good, so sharp, so quick of thought as well as act. And just any encouragement in the wrong areas of the pitch is invariably going to end up in a goal. And that, I'm sure they're well aware of it, the Norwich squad and the Norwich coaching staff, but that penny has to drop, that you cannot give any encouragement to any team at this level, really, because they're all packed with more established, maybe over the entire squads, maybe more quality as well, and they will punish teams. And for me, that's the enduring frustration of Arsenal's winner, that it wasn't anything about offsides or VAR checks. I think, it's pretty conclusive now that Aubameyang was onside. And handballs even, because, you'll get some of them and you want to get others on occasion. But it's just that if Max Aarons brings that ball down and plays it to a Norwich shirt, if Tim Krul tries to add a bit more variety, because, that tactic we've seen quite often now. And I'm sure it's very, very clear to teams scouting Norwich and looking to do their analysis that, there is a desire for Krul to try and build the play. And without that variety, and I think you run the risk of this happening on a more regular basis, that, ultimately teams know if they press high, they press wide, they're going to sort of choke what Norwich are trying to do. And if Norwich persist down that route, while it sort of cuts to the heart of what Farke's trying to do and how he wants to build the play, I think that there needs to be an acceptance that, on occasion, in certain circumstances, in certain types of game and certain times of game as well, you just have to come up with something a little bit different, a little bit more variety, as I say, because, that ball that Krul played to Aarons was by no means the first time he'd attempted that ball in the entirety of that game, and nor in the previous games as well. So, it puts a huge premium on Krul and Norwich's fullbacks or the centre-backs to be absolutely faultless in possession. And at this level, any minor detail invariably will get punished. So I think overall reflections on that whole incident isn't really tilted towards, aren't Norwich unlucky again? Haven't they fallen the wrong side of VAR again? It's more, well, that was entirely avoidable if Norwich hadn't committed the initial error for me.
I would be inclined to agree. It's sort of back to the element of you make your own luck, isn't it? And that's why the teams at the top of the Premier League get a lot of VAR decisions in their favour, because ultimately they're probably more ruthless and have a bit more quality as well. So you need to take the preventative steps in order to ensure that those kind of events, those kind of attacks don't happen. And you referenced variety. We saw Emile Smith-Rowe have a glorious opportunity from Tim Krul again, just essentially kicking the ball straight to him. He then had to produce a pretty decent save. That was kind of a regular occurrence as the game accelerated towards kind of the final whistle, and it felt the closer we kind of got after Arsenal's goal to the final whistle, the more likely it looked that they were going to grab a second, as opposed to a Norwich equaliser, which probably kind of underpins the whole point about their attacking edge and their attacking quality. That probably sums up Arsenal quite nicely, Pad. So now to look ahead to that Watford game next Saturday, which already 5 games into the season, from maybe purely from a mood point, rather than giving us any underlying answers as to whether Norwich City are going to stay in the Premier League, it feels massive, doesn't it? Because if Norwich City show all the same problems that we've spoken about at length for the first 43 minutes of this podcast, and they lose again in front of a full Carrow Road crowd, that fragile optimism is going to turn and evaporate pretty quickly, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I really do not want to have to face a scenario where we're picking through a Norwich defeat, unless it's the most contentious and highly unlucky defeat going, because Norwich have battered Watford, and whoever is Backman, isn't it, the Austrian lad international, he's had a worldie and defied Norwich almost single-handedly. If there's some sort of mitigation, then fine. But if it's Norwich are toothless again, they don't carry enough threat. Timu Puki's looking a little bit of a lost soul. The defensive protection, to the back four isn't there. There's naivety again in terms of maybe some of the decision making in the defensive third from Norwich. All the things we've talked about in this previous 40 odd minutes, if they are stamped through a performance, and more importantly, now let's be honest, we can talk about performances all we want now, but it's about results. I think now it's getting to the point where they need to put points on the board, and if they don't manage to achieve that this coming Saturday at Carrow Road, then I don't think there'll be too much optimism around come 5 o'clock on the final whistle. That is for sure. I think there'll be a lot of doom and gloom and a lot of searing questions being asked to Farke. Absolutely, because ultimately, if this is going to be different, then there has to be a starting point. There has to be a line in the sand, and there has to be a bit of a break from what we've seen in these first 4 games, which, again, risk of repeating ourselves, a lot of positive elements, but not enough when you stitch them together over any 90-minute period to pick up points. So that fundamentally for me is what these next few days leading into Watford are about. It's, can Daniel settle on an 11, melding young, old, new, round the block a few times in Norwich colours, but an 11 essentially that can do the job, because ultimately, as I say, Watford, bar that opening weekend, they're not exactly ripping up any trees. They got beat at home to Wolves this past weekend. Yes, they'll have decent quality players. Sarr, he was excellent at Carrow Road towards the end of last season. There we remind ourselves Watford won that game. And so they have players who can hurt Norwich, but fundamentally they're not in the same bracket as Liverpool, Manchester City, Leicester, and even an ailing, yet still packed with very good players, Arsenal. So, this is a team who Norwich should be able to go out, put on a performance to get a result. And if they don't, then ultimately I think the pressure starts to build. And that's not pressure in terms of Daniel Farke and his position. That's just broadly, because that's part of the broader issue, which is pressure on, can Norwich book the odds in a far more competitive fashion than they managed over the entire piece 2 seasons ago when they were, let's be honest, I've said it before, obviously there was mitigation because of how the second part of that season was played out in terms of empty stadia, but fundamentally they were nowhere near good enough as a group of players, nowhere near good enough as a coaching staff, and they finished a long, long way adrift. And it was quite embarrassing how far adrift they were of what was required to compete at the Premier League, not even to stay in the Premier League. So, for all those reasons, different times now, a lot of different players, but still fundamentally the same objective, which is to try and prove that they can be competitive. I think that's ultimately the starting point for me, because if they're competitive, then they should be able to pick up points. And if they can pick up points, then they should be able to prolong at least an attempt to stay in the division. But if they're not competitive, and for me, competitive now is picking up results. It's not going 20 minutes toe-to-toe with Arsenal at the Emirates, or Liverpool for an hour on the opening day, or Leicester for long spells, but then ultimately falling short, whether through what the other team are doing or what Norwich are contributing to their own downfall. Competitive now for me is Watford this Saturday, Carrow Road, coming off that pitch with a result and then taking it on to the next game, another eminently winnable game, and the one after that, and the one after that. There's a run now, 4 or 5 teams who are clubs you would expect to be potentially in and around, and well, certainly in the bottom half of the Premier League. So, it's really the starting pistol on a massive, maybe season-defining phase now for Daniel Farke.
Yeah, you referenced that run of games. I've got it in front of me here. Particularly the next 5 home games you would be looking at from a Norwich City perspective, and making the case that if this time is to be different, if this is going to be the year that they stay in the Premier League, then this run of fixtures is going to be one that they're going to have to extract a fair few points from, starting on Saturday at home to Watford. But just to look at their home games in that period, the next 5 home games, starting obviously with Watford, it's then Brighton, Leeds, Southampton, and then Wolves. So probably 5 games that from a Norwich perspective you would be targeting points. Away from home in that time, they've got Burnley after they go to Everton. They've obviously then got Chelsea, which is I think is going to be extremely difficult, but there's also Brentford in there. There's Newcastle away in there, and then you're looking at a difficult sort of 3 games or so when you've got Tottenham, Manchester United, and Villa in December. So now between now and kind of December the 1st, which is that Newcastle game at St James's Park, that will be the kind of telling run of games as to whether this time is going to be different, because of their 21 points that they got last time. It's worth pointing out that 8 of those, I think, came against Leicester, where they got 4 points. They obviously beat Manchester City, and they drew with Arsenal, didn't they, at Carrow Road? So maybe this run of 4 games, if we're going to bring it full circle and end the pod with a bit of optimism as well, maybe it's proof that isn't going to define where Norwich City are this season, because they got results against these teams last time around and failed to stay in the Premier League. Just finally then, Pad, we haven't spoken about Brandon Williams yet. I thought he was exceptional on Saturday. Nicolas Pepe, over £70 million worth of player. There were numerous moments where he made several wonderful challenges. The block in the second half, obviously one slight blemish on what was an exceptional performance with maybe his contribution to the goal. But one challenge, I think just before half-time on Pepe, when he seemingly got away from him and he managed to get his leg round from nowhere to win the ball. It actually prompted some applause from Daniel Farke, was tremendous. But if that is kind of a citer of what's to come for the on-loan Manchester United left-back, then Norwich City have got a hell of a defender, haven't they?
And also the goal-saving block as well, early in the second half, where it's kind of veered towards Pepe, back post, stick it in, lad, and Brandon Williams almost comes out of the frame just to appear and slide in block, because otherwise that's a goal. He was, and it was so good to see, because he comes off the pitch against Leicester prior to the international break, and I'm sure his head was down because he knows himself he was ultimately majorly at fault for their opening goal, and to bounce back says a lot about the guy's character, which I think we've already deduced anyway. He's not from a particularly I'll choose my words, but he's from a part of Manchester where they know all about graft and.
He's some of his family members are boxers, aren't they? He seems to have a boxing tradition in his family as well, and you can certainly see that with the way he plays football. No,
absolutely, and that was stamped through what we saw at the Emirates. That combativeness and desire to defend his lines and defend his flank, and let's be honest, that's why Yanulis was injured and not in consideration for Arsenal, but that's why he was dipped out, because he hasn't shown that defensive nous, not just this season, to be fair to him, but I don't think that's something you necessarily associate with the guy's game from the time he's been in England, that's for sure, and he'll need to find that, because given where Norwich are and what their aim is in this division, there's going to be a lot of times when they're going to have to be good defensively and resolute and willing to put their body on the line and show that athleticism and be able to put a tackle in, and a perfectly timed tackle as well, given the era we live in now, in terms of you can't really tackle, but he certainly was the exemption to that rule yesterday with some of his, they were full-blooded throwback type challenges, but perfectly timed. And he is the man in possession now on that left-hand side of Norwich's defence. If he maintains that level, I don't see Yanulis getting back in anytime soon. And ultimately, that's great to see, because, we're talking about have Norwich improved their squad with this summer outlay, and he's obviously one who's come in on a loan from Manchester United. But for me, unquestionably, that is an upgrade on what Norwich maybe had in the left-back areas. Certainly, I would say last season and obviously this season. Now, we don't want to get too carried away, because it was one 90-minute outing, and after Leicester, I think we were probably thinking, well, he looks a bit off it in terms of what's required. But he's probably a prime example of somebody who's now had, referencing what we said right at the outset, the Kabak and Norman coming in almost 24, 48 hours before the game. He's a guy now who's probably been in the club for a month or so. He's got to grips with it. He's had all that time to train, to acclimatise, to adapt, to understand the demands that Daniel Farke places on him as an individual, but also within that defensive unit. And maybe now, yesterday was the first sign of the level of performance that he can reach. And if you can get something similar from the other newer players who are coming in and just on that journey as well to kind of integrate themselves completely, then again, if we're ending on a positive note, then I think there are grounds for optimism, because, certainly his level yesterday was, for me, what Norwich need to attain as a collective. If they get to that level, more often than not, week in, week out, they'll be good enough to stay in this division.
Yeah, I'll credit Radio Norfolk's Rob Butler, who called him, Brandon Stewart Pearce Williams, on the evidence of his performance on Saturday, which is more than justified. I think we'll leave it there. Paddy, thank you very much for joining me. I think that was therapeutic more than anything after 4 straight defeats. Hopefully, as we say, next weekend against Watford will be different, and we'll bring you a podcast in light of a victory, which would certainly be lovely after the first month of Premier League football that we've had. You can, of course, listen to the PinkUn podcast on Future Radio as well. I believe that goes out on Wednesday evening, so well worth checking that out. And of course, PinkUn.com, the place to go for all the latest Norwich City news, analysis and reaction to this defeat, and as well build up to Watford next weekend. Thank you all very much for listening, watching, wherever you find this, and we'll see you again very, very soon.